Well, it gives me great pleasure to be chairing this panel session this afternoon. We have four speakers who I'll introduce in a moment. They'll speak in turn for maybe 5 to 7 minutes or so on some aspect, their response to the legacy of Amazing Grace, how that speaks to them, whether in a personal or professional context, and then we'll open up to the floor for questions, and members of the panel will be pleased to respond and engage in some discussion. I'm Martin Clarke, I'm the head of music at Wootton University, being involved with the organisation of the conference today and the day we had at the OU yesterday. And I'm really pleased to welcome four colleagues here. The Right Reverend Hudson-Wilkin, who is the Bishop of Cowper, and will be the patron of the Friends of the Caribbean Association here in or nearby Milton Keynes. Then we have the Reverend Wootton, who is Executive President of the Hymn Society of Great Britain and Ireland. Professor Simon Lee, who is Professor of Law at the Open University, and Dr. Marcel Silversteinadel, who is Assistant Professor of Sacred Music at Southern Methodist University, Dallas. That's the order I've asked people to speak. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Richard Rose to start us off. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I am going to try and keep within approximately 7 minutes because I really do enjoy hearing questions. I want to hear more questions because it means that you are engaging. So I'm going to put my stopwatch on now and then I will start. Lord, how come me here? Lord, how come me? Lord, how come me here? I wish that I never was born. Oh, how I wish that I never was born. Imagine my ancestors singing those words. And perhaps it's because of what lies behind those words, why they were then able, interesting question about the Psalms, because then they were able to go to the Psalms and appropriate the words from the Psalm also. By the rivers of Babylon, where we sat down, and yea, we wailed when we remembered Zion. For the wicked carried us away, captivity required from us a song. Now how can we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? But that was exactly what was being asked of us, to sing the Lord's song in a strange land. And I want to suggest that for me, the legacy of Amazing Grace is the reality that we are able to sing the Lord's song. And we sing the Lord's song not from a place of you are being pushed and you don't really want to and you're being pushed, but from a recognition that we have been redeemed. We sing the Lord's song from a place that says, there but for the grace of God. And that is really important. I was thinking about our national heroes of Jamaica. And what is interesting, our slave masters taught us, they thought, Christianity. But then and they gave us their interpretation of Christianity. But we were able to teach ourselves to read, and when we read it ourselves, and when we meditated on that and connected with God ourselves, we realized that we were not meant to be enslaved. So the same scripture that our slave masters used and thought that we could pull a wool over their eyes, the Spirit of God told us a different story. And we actually believed what the Spirit of God said. And that enabled us to sing the Lord's song in a strange land. And there's something quite powerful about this. Where's my brother? My brother, I tell the world that I did not learn my theology at theological college. And so people might be like, really? No, I did not learn my theology at theological college. I actually learned my theology through the men and women around me. Those older women and older men in the community who didn't just talk about God academically or as a cultural stuff. God was real. God was real. So when they had nothing, I heard my folks say, the Lord will provide. The Lord will provide. And He did. God provided. There was always food. We were never hungry, although we were very poor. They had this confidence that God would provide each time. And if they were leaving somewhere, they wouldn't just, say, bye, see you tomorrow. Because the reply would come back, if the Lord wills. There was just that innate sense that says, here I am but for the grace of God. So don't take it for granted. And there were those who thought, that's a white man God you're talking about. And I would hear my folks say, don't try to tell me that God is dead. He woke me up this morning. Don't try to tell me that God is dead. He lives within my soul. He opened up my blinded eyes and set me to rejoice. So don't try to tell me that God is dead. He lives within my soul. So this powerful sense of God is present. I don't care what you're saying to me. God is present. And so, for example, when I watched, and I've watched it a few times, The Amazing Grace that Aretha Franklin did. I've seen the others as well. But when I watched that one with Amazing Grace, you mentioned the time. 10 minutes, she holds it. She holds every word. Because we understand. I once was lost, but now I'm found. I had the privilege of going to Ghana, and when I went to Ghana, I noticed that the caves where black people were held, those who were taking, they weren't slaves, they were being enslaved. The caves that they were being kept in below ground. Someone thought it was a brilliant idea to build a church above it. What on earth is going on in their mind? How did they do that? And yet, these words, I once was lost, but now I'm found. Blind, but now I see. And it was grace that taught me, God's grace. Because those who tried to hold me down could not. Because God's grace told me something else. How precious. And within our tradition we have this sort of the speech is given and someone answers back. I loved it in The Amazing Grace. I just absolutely loved it. Because what people were doing, they were saying, I identify with that. I hear that. I see that. I feel that. I know that. I have been there. And God's grace has also spoken to me. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Twas grace that brought me safe thus far, and I'm trusting God to lead, that grace will lead me home. So, legacy, I want to talk about confidence, because that's what I've seen in my folks, in my black folks. Confidence in Christ through the grace of God. I also want to say in terms of legacy, hope, confidence, hope. And finally, I want to say resilience. Confidence, hope, resilience. Thank you.
I'll transfer it over to Dr. Wootton.
I'm never quite sure if I can see over these things. But my dad used to tell me I should grow another foot. I want to take us to the place where Professor Heinmarsh brought us to this morning, and that is that Amazing Grace, the song, the hymn, was not known in this country until fairly recently. 250 years we're honouring today, a fifth of that, it's been known in this country for, widely known. And so for people of my generation, we came to it in our teenage years. We came to it in a unique way, unique in the history of hymnody, really. And I'm fascinated by the way in which the hymn entered into British hymnody. It didn't appear in any mainstream denominational hymn book that I can find anyway, up until the middle of the 20th century. So if you grew up in a congregational church, or an Anglican church, a Methodist church, Baptist church, you were not singing Amazing Grace. You were singing a whole host of other things. You were singing Cowper's Over a Closer Walk with God, or John Bunyan's, I'm also from John Bunyan's church, Bunyan's Who Would True Valour See? Not He Who Would Valiant Be, by the way, that's a watered down version. Who would true valour see? Let him come hither. And yesterday I was talking about Cowper, Newton, and the legacy from John Bunyan that comes down through them. We were singing those, but we didn't know the song Amazing Grace. It wasn't in the mainstream hymn books, but neither was it in the Cliff College choruses, the Keswick hymn book. It just didn't appear. The first place that I can find it appearing for British singers was in here. Anyone remember this book? Yes, 1 or 2. Faith, Hope and Clarity. There was also Faith, Hope and Festivity, Faith, Hope and Nativity. And that put Amazing Grace. It's the second one in the book. It was published in 1967. And it was part of the folk revival of hymns. And it's published alongside hymns about homelessness, hunger, racism. It's published alongside hymns of hope for the future. It's published alongside Show Me the Prison, Show Me the Jail. So well-known and well-established campaigning songs and new songs being written about the drug culture, about prostitution. They're in here. It was not a very popular book among the people who were old Christians at the time when I was a young Christian. And what they said was, look here, they said, you've got Amazing Grace here, and it says copyright 1967 by Galliard Limited. And they said, don't you know, you stupid young people, that that's a very old hymn? And we said, yes, we do know. We're understanding that. The copyright was to that particular version of it. And there's a whole story to be told about copyright and the power that it gives people. But it was the folk revival. We were singing old hymns, old songs from many different cultures. But we were singing about homelessness, about racism, about the transformation of society. And what that does is to put Amazing Grace not among the hymns that we've been singing for 250 years or 200 years by then. It didn't suffer the fate of having been an established Christian hymn for all that time, sung by English congregations in English churches very co-facedly in the way that we sang many hymns. It came like a thunderbolt into our worship, and it was there alongside the social justice, liberation theology movement. It came in with the liberation theologies, black liberation theology, feminist theology, which is where, and womanist theology, those theologies where my heart lies, Latin American liberation theologies, and so on. So it put it alongside hymns by songs by Sidney Carter. It put it alongside When I Needed a Neighbour, Were You There? It was on a Friday morning when they took me from the cell. There wouldn't be an apple if it wasn't in the plan. It's God they ought to crucify. I said to you and me, I said to the carpenter are hanging on the tree. Very radical views of scripture, hymns about scripture. And so Amazing Grace came in with those. And so for my generation, who came to this hymn suddenly and dramatically at that time, part of its reception history is that it gained a certain street cred among the young people at that time. We thought it was a cool hymn and good to sing, as we were singing all the other things. But it also dislocates it from the establishment hymnody. And I think that does to it something fascinating, because it benefits by not having been tainted with the history of traditional hymnody. And I do believe that gives it a certain freedom to be used as part of what you were saying, Anthony was saying earlier, that not everything that can be faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed without being faced. And the task that we share together is to face, from the Hymn Society particularly, what do we do about our hymns? I'm speaking next week about the hymnody of empire and colonial hymnody, and the verses that are neatly excised that actually talk about the colonialism of mission. There's a vast and deep task in decolonializing the legacy, the various legacies we have. And I wonder, in Amazing Grace, we have a text that might be an asset in that task because of the way that it has taken off right around the world. What we discovered when we were young was that we started singing Amazing Grace, fabulous, all those wonderful words. We discovered A, that the rest of the world had known it for years and years and years, and B, that it had a message that was rooted and speaks to the real lives of people. And so that's the legacy of Amazing Grace from this particular perspective, but I think it is therefore a liberating perspective.
Thank you very much indeed. Next speaker is Professor Simon Lee.
Thank you. Good afternoon. I'm going to start my stopwatch as well, but I'm not going to sing, to be very rude. I'm primarily here, I think, as a resident of Olney, a relatively recent one, and in my spare time, I'm a professor of law here at University, and emeritus professor of jurisprudence at Queen's Belfast, where I worked during the Troubles and the peace process. When I left there, I had a chance of naming a university in Liverpool, which I called Liverpool Hope University College, a church merger. And if I hadn't called it Hope, which had lots of Liverpool connotations, I might well have called it Grace. But I've been fascinated by grace and hope all my working life. When I was appointed in Queen's Belfast, disappointed candidates, including David Trimble, thought that I was the beneficiary of reverse discrimination. You see before you a white privileged old man and so on. They saw a Catholic. So that's some of the background where I'm coming from, and I say all that because I agree with what Professor Reddy said at the start, when he was talking about when we talk about God, perhaps saying more about ourselves. That is how I was taught to view law. That when you give a view on a legal case, you're giving, expression used at Yale Law School where I studied, is one view of the cathedral. And the reference is to Monet's studies into cathedral at Rouen. I call it legal impressionism. You think you're painting the cathedral, but you may not be a very good painter, or I might not like the picture, I might. But what I can tell is your perspective, where your vantage point was. And if we have different people painting from all around the cathedral, we build up a more holistic picture. But if we don't understand what a cathedral is for, we don't go inside, we don't worship within it, we'll never completely understand the cathedral. And so that's why question and answer sessions are important. It's important speakers stick to time, because all of our perspectives enrich our understanding of the Cathedral of Law. So I guess that's why I'm here. And I wanted to say that this very church featured in an ecclesiastical court case last year, 2021. And I have with me the complete judgment, which is only 5 pages. Those who were at the conference yesterday will know that I didn't print out the judgment in the 2022 case about Tobias Rustad's memorial in Jesus College, Cambridge, because it's over 100 pages. But this case is about the little exhibition idea and some changes to the way in which Newton is described in what we think of as his church. And you can't just do that without permission, authorization, or it's called a faculty. And you have to make an application. If it's contested, there will be a hearing. But in any event, the Chancellor of the Diocese will decide, or in their absence, a Deputy Chancellor. And not everybody has grasped that it was the same judge in those 2 cases. In 2021, it was David Hodge QC, who is the Chancellor of the Diocese of Oxford, but for all sorts of reasons, the Chancellor of the Diocese of Ealing stood down from the case in 2022, the Tobias Rustad memorial case, and it was heard by the Deputy Chancellor, who is David Hodge. Now, he loved the application here, which was without any disagreement. And if we had more time, perhaps in answer to questions, I could read you what he said. He's very complimentary about the whole church warden's approach, the church's approach, the parish's approach to it. He wasn't so keen on Jesus College, Cambridge's approach. And an easy thing to say is that, well, you would say that, wouldn't he? Because he was white. And when I was a student, it was a long time ago, in the 1970s, people used to say, if they didn't like a judicial decision, old white men, now including me, middle class, Oxbridge, whatever, they're all the same, they all decide in the same conservative way. I used to call that the Tory Ben thesis, because Tony Benn at the time was one of the most radical politicians, and he was old and white and male, in his case public school and Oxbridge. But actually, those judges disagreed with one another. You have a 3-2 split decision, overturning on appeal, a 3-0 decision, overturning on appeal, a single decision. We've got to have a more complex understanding, it seems to me, of cases. But we do need to see that they're often about the facts, and disputes about the facts. And the Tobias Rustad case was because in the 17th century, so 100 years before Newton, there was this character who was a benefactor to the college, gave him a lot of money. He hadn't been at the college, but his father had been. He hadn't gone to university. He was a royal courtier. And it turned out that he had invested in slave trading companies. And the new master of the college, quite understandably, wanted to change the memorial. But the way the college went about it did not resonate well with the judge. There were a lot of opponents. One of them, Lawrence Goldman, who edited the Oxford Dictionary of National Biography, gave an analogy to that project, saying, we don't just throw people out when we discover that they were from the Dictionary of National Biography, when we discover that they did horrible things. We contextualise, we update every entry, but we don't delete. We try to make an analogy to the memorial. And one of the ways he put it was, if Rustad now, why not Cranmer? Because Thomas Cranmer has a memorial in that chapel, and is the most famous person associated with Jesus College, Cambridge, although slightly unclear exactly how all that worked. But Professor Goldman said, Cranmer was a murderous misogynist who'd shown violent hostility to religious freedom and all those who had rebelled against the English Reformation or had held to the old Roman Catholic religion and its ways, and so on and so forth. So, these matters are complex, but I think that Jesus College should regroup. They decided not to appeal, but I think they should regroup and come again in a way which suggests that they have reflected, but they've also got good arguments for their case. And one of the things which struck me about their case was it was held in situ, that the court met here, well, in Jesus College Chapel, where it was about, and I think they could create a kind of incorporation of the memorial into a representation of that process and of the way in which we all have to reflect on the law, not for its own sake, but as a way of achieving justice. So thank you very much for this opportunity to contribute here. Thank you.
Simon, and finally Marcel.
I'm adhere to the tradition of the stopwatch. Greetings, it's good to be with you. Thank you for the opportunity to be here. I'm a Brazilian stuck in Texas. So my talk about the legacies of Amazing Grace navigates a number of resonances, and I'm grateful for Dr. Heinmarsh, for Dr. Rev'd, for the perspectives they've given us today, because they really do paint this picture when I think about, as I pull on the thread of Amazing Grace within Brazilian hymnody, which is, what I do. It's a legacy that resonates with the slave trade within the context of the British Empire. The three first hymnals published in Brazil of Protestant hymnody were published by British missionaries, or missionaries from Great Britain, and one by a Polish Jew by way of London. So there's a theme there, right? The missionary presence that comes through the channels of that trade. There's a resonance of the force and the weight of these missionary movements upon the face and the voice, the singing voice of Brazilian Christianity. And there are extra layers of American cultural imperialism in Brazil in the 20th century. So my lens through which I kind of look at all of this is very much a lens of a Latin American kind of liberation, weird theologian, music person. And that's what I do. When I started looking at Amazing Grace and how it pops in and out of hymnals in Brazil, it very much follows that same pattern where you don't hear much about it until the second half of the 20th century. It starts popping up. And my analysis led me to three main hymnals from three denominations in Brazil that translated Amazing Grace. These are all very different texts. The titles don't match. The only thing that's similar is that they're all 4 stanzas long, but it's very much a text of that varies. So lost and found in some of these Brazilian versions become dark and light. There's a lot of light imagery which is not necessarily found in the original. There's a strong heavenly presence, that idea that Newton put there of within the veil reference to the afterlife in the Brazilian version is peppered throughout many different stanzas of many different versions. The wretched becomes the poor in the Latin American versions. So it really got me thinking about what this legacy means. And I went to I watched dozens and dozens of performances of Amazing Grace by Brazilian artists, Brazilian church choirs, Brazilian church musicians, popular artists. And I arrived at this kind of drift, this tension. And in that sense, I think that the legacy of hymns like Amazing Grace within these contexts are much like those years of Newton's life when he was in between, when he was struggling with both the beginning of what he described as his conversion experience and his professional activity in the slave trade, those kind of liminal, confusing years. That's the tension, I think, that describes a lot of this hymnody. When I look at the performance, I see a spectrum that ranges from downright imitation of either the English Anglican aesthetic with all the accoutrements of your SATB choral organ experience to very Brazilian renditions that kind of reconstruct Amazing Grace as samba. Preciosa graça de Jesus. Everything seems to fall out of where it should be from it just offends every Anglican sensibility, but it makes sense. It absolutely makes sense if you can dance along. So you have this range that goes between the imitation of an aesthetic or a set of aesthetics that have been handed to us as the proper way to sing this thing, to what Brazilian intellectual Oswald de Andrade in the 1920s and 30s would call anthropophagy, where you literally will take whatever you give us. We'll take whatever areola, who own most of the Brazilian music market up to the middle of the 20th century, whatever jazz, whatever Glenn Miller, whatever we'll take it. But we're absolutely going to transform it. And it'll become a case of cultural virulence, of religious virulence, of a political statement. We will make it ours. So the resonances of Amazing Grace confused me. And it's a legacy I wasn't sure what to do with. And I kind of moved from a place of translation. I work a lot with performance studies and translation studies when I analyze these artifacts and how they flow along these lines of power, religion, business, and money and capital. And I started with the idea of translation. It's like, okay, we have one English text. Okay, it gets translated. This is how that happens. Let's look at the text. But you start looking at the performances and the variety of translation. Well, amazing is a word that does not exist in Portuguese. So it becomes incredible. It becomes precious. It becomes this other thing. And in the process, it's not a translation. Well, maybe it's a mosaic. Maybe it's a kaleidoscope. But that doesn't work either, because all of these metaphors, they presuppose this symmetry, this kind of thought craft that goes into planning something that's visually stunning. So, okay, maybe it's not a mosaic. Maybe it's not a kaleidoscope of legacies. Maybe it's a fractal. But there's a problem there, because fractals are also based on algorithms. The sense of organization that goes against the aesthetics of messiness that I tend to, as a good Brazilian, I've changed this talk 5 times today. But we improvise, it's what we do. And finally, as I listened to our speakers, I came up with this image of a shattered mirror. It's a shattered mirror because it cracks and breaks along the fault lines of these relationships, of imperialist, colonialist flows that go back and forth, that have to do with Brazil's convoluted history within Latin America, its relation to the slave trade as well. So maybe it's a legacy that's a shattered mirror that we can hold up to that history, and that gives us an opportunity to reflect not only on that one hymn, but how we stand ethically and aesthetically at these crossroads, which I think is a great image. As a scholar, there's this temptation, I think, of pretending neutrality. So this is what the data shows. Well, the data shows me a shattered mirror that I'm a part of, and that I have this very weird relationship with. Thank you.
Right, thanks to our 4 panelists. We now have plenty of time for questions and discussion. There's a roving microphone at the back. So if you have a question, please do raise your hand. Please do wait for the microphone to come to you so that everyone can hear. Entirely up to you. If you want to direct your question to one of the panelists, that's absolutely fine. If you want to leave an open question, and we'll see which of the panelists feels most compelled to respond, then we can do it that way too. So it's entirely open to see how the discussion is shaped over the next half an hour or so. So invite your questions. One of the back over on that sideline, please.
I'll move so I can be seen, or I can see you actually, more than anything. I was just kind of thinking and over the last 2 days and what I've heard, as a non-scholar, as a lay person, what I've understood, and what that might mean for the younger generation. Obviously in America, particularly, as we've heard, Amazing Grace is well known. It's generational. The legacies, I think, are going to be known for quite some time. But I do wonder about the generations that are going to come here. Will they know about it? will they understand that where it's come from, the generational understanding, those who are non-Christian, will they take something from that? And what will the legacy be in another 50 years' time, maybe 100 years' time?
Thank you very much, Andrew. And I'll hand this back to Bishop Russell.
That is our responsibility, to ensure that the next generation knows about it. And that's going to come not just by us telling them, but by us living what that amazing grace looks like and engaging with them. And that's something we don't do very well, I think, as Christians. And certainly, yes, as Christians, as British Christians, we're not very good with engaging and talking about faith and singing about faith and living faith out with the next generation and the next generation.
Thank you for that. Excellent question. And the participation of the youth in this whole year, which I think is just very important. One of the things I would say is that we have this text from 1st of January 1773, but I don't believe in an original intent in either in law or in other disciplines. In other words, you just want to know who was Newton or what did Newton think. I think each generation has a responsibility to write their own chapter in the common law, for instance. And so you build generation after generation. And I don't think we would have the legacy of Amazing Grace if it wasn't for the William Walker tune added in the 1830s. And then, as we've heard today, all the popular and folk cultural music that came in the post-war era, and particularly for generations now, the very moving address by President Barack Obama at that, in a wonderful eulogy to the Reverend Clement Pinckney. And I said yesterday that the way in which, it wasn't just that he broke into song, but it was a beautiful eulogy all the way through, the references to grace building up to it, and an allusion to Cowper's line, probably from the very same day, God moves in a mysterious way with wonders to perform. Absolutely stunning, which I think has given Amazing Grace a legacy. And I agree with Bishop Rose, it's our responsibility to take it forward.
Just briefly to say that hymns come and go, it's more important, it's vitally important that the message of Amazing Grace is carried on, and we should keep an eye on what, as a human community, a Christian community, watch what is being sung and learn from across the generations, so that it wouldn't worry me if Amazing Grace, the hymn, disappeared for another 50 years, as long as we are still singing about God's amazing grace, and as long as we're still singing about, as long as our worship doesn't shy away from the other things that came in for me with that, which is the social realities of life, the injustices, and that empire does not triumph, and that Christian music doesn't disappear into heaven without taking root in the earth. But for one hymn, I'd be sorry, but we're going to be singing it in heaven.
Thank you very much. I think there was a question, gentleman, just in front of the pillar there.
Thank you. It's a very interesting day. Can I ask a question as I am an organist? I know Martin is a professional one. Most organists have played Amazing Grace in church many times. They've been asked for weddings, funerals, and so on. It's a beautiful tune, and it's the tune that has really made this poem stick. And I wonder, has the poem been set to any other tune that is as memorable? I know the original tune was a bit four-square. It's an 8/6 tune, isn't it? 8/6 common made up. So one question is, have the set to any other level of tune, and has a tune been used for any other words. I'm thinking of Charles Wesley. I'm not going to sing. Help us to help each other, Lord, each other's cross to bear, let each his friendly aid afford, and feel his brother's care. It works perfectly. So I just wondered about the musical dimensions of this extraordinary phenomenon.
If I might speak briefly about what friends on the panel may wish to add to this. We heard a little this morning in Bruce Highmarsh's talk of some of the tunes that may well have been sung to it prior to the tune now being written. A fuguing tune that Bruce played as a clip-off and suggested that the complex nature of part of that may be part of why it didn't stick. I do think you're right that the association with Wootton is a major part. I talked a little about this yesterday at the OU, how, although we describe it as a hymn, it has a lot of the characteristics of a song in the sort of popular music world that is something that is a fixed combination of words and music and indeed often associated with particular artists as well. We might talk about different people's versions of Amazing Grace. In Barrett Barnes, we talked about Amy Jackson, we heard earlier, and many others besides. I think I've heard different words sung, but principally because the melody is so familiar, and in an era where hymn melodies are less culturally familiar, Amazing Grace is the one that can be a little more relied on, that more people will know. So that's the way I've heard it. So it still relies on Amazing Grace. So there is that relationship ongoing, I think, between words and music. Anybody else wants to add to that? Janice, on that side? Sorry.
We did look at a different tune. Was it this morning?
Yes.
And I thought the other tune was of a very different nature. It had some repeated lines in it, and it was, I think, it looked to me like a hymn, like a tune like Lydia, and I can't immediately call the tunes to mind, but the one thing that will come to mind is Ilkley Moor Baltat, because we're very much along those lines, and these were written. I was sorry to hear it dismissed this morning, because those hymns, those repeated line tunes, were very, very popular, and they were being written. All Hail the Power of Jesus' Name has one of the da 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 da. Great fun to sing, huge tune, and they were being written and sung. So I would love to hear Amazing Grace sung to that, to see if that would work by a congregation that could pick it up and go with it like that. Because it would change the nature of the tune as well. I'm involved in editing and encouraging hymn writers and composers. And one thing we do is get several tunes to one text and see how they change it. We can have a go at that.
Simon.
I'd be delighted if an organist would play God Moves in a Mysterious Way to the New Britain tune, Amazing Grace, because that's also 86.
Yeah.
God moves in a mysterious way as wonders to the fall, plants his footsteps in the sea and rides upon the storm. And I think that would be a way of Newton, in death as in life, helping his friend Cowper, because that's a wonderful phrase, but the overall hymn hasn't had the same kind of tune. And from the sublime to the ridiculous, where we used to live, we had a big church Christmas carol service in the Anglican church, and what brought the house down was our son-in-law comes from an evangelical guitar playing tradition, playing while shepherds watched their flocks by night, not to Ilkley Moor Baltat, which is possible, but to supercalifragilisticexpialidocious.
Yeah, I think one of the things that we have to remember is the necessities that breed the kind of ways of knowing that we end up using as categories, right? So the whole kind of text and tune system arose from a tradition and is carried out in hymnology as kind of a lens that we use to analyze hymns that focus within that tradition. But I really do think that the music of the church is very much an unpredictable kind of wild animal, and that's part of the fun, right? You don't know. You might schedule things with a choir and an organ, and then Sunday morning comes along and you have a ukulele player and a djembe, and you have to make it work. So I think finding joy in kind of the unpredictability of those combinations and that open attitude, while at the same time we celebrate the legacy, is part of the ethical responsibility of church musicians and scholars. In a sense, it's like putting together a new dish. So we're going to bring in a different ingredient and see what that does. The congregation may or may not like it.
And for me, it's probably something to do with the Holy Spirit. Because when I've heard black gospel singers, they're not wedded to a particular tune. They might take it, they may start with it, but they move it as being led by the Spirit. And perhaps we are too dependent on the written music in front of us, but we just take it places.
Further questions? Yeah, one.
I went to a Catholic school and I have a large repertoire of hymns, of which I know every verse. But it was also in the sort of 1970s, so there were more modern tunes coming in, some of the older hymns and that sort of thing. I just wonder if the panel feels the same way I do. You go to a church and you think, oh, I know this one, and then they play the tune. And that can either be in the more traditional setting of a church such as this, where perhaps the organist has an even wider repertoire of tunes and chooses something they don't know and don't like and won't sing because it's sulk. Or in just evangelical churches, where perhaps everything is more recent, and the screens go up and the words come up, and I thought, well, I'm not going to sing that hymn again. I won't remember it because it took me most of the verses to learn it. So I just wondered what you feel is the sort of future of hymnody in the context of that rather mixed account I just gave you.
We'll give about 19 minutes to address that question. We'll try that. Simon's just suggested that you've given the task to me, which thank you very much. I think, bringing back to Amazing Grace, maybe will help a little. There is something around the reliance on knowing, and I think that is something that churches, church leaders, church musicians are grappling with what that means now. I think they've always grappled with what it meant. Janet talked about, you just referred to the influx of new hymns, new tunes in that era. You referred to the evangelical repertoire of the more recent years. So there's always been that sense, but there's been, I think, an assumption that certain things were culturally familiar that is now being pulled, tested much, much more. And it does point to that binding with music, because that is the way it's experienced. Not, the words are on the screen or the words are in the book. People learn it, experience it by singing. The era of having a hymn book at home is very largely gone. So the ways in which things are learned, I think, is very much, that's not an answer, it's more an affirmation of what you're saying, but I wonder if anybody else wants to take a name on that.
Yeah, that's
Have I said it all? Sorry.
check, there we go. I think that's a very tricky question to answer in any kind of comprehensive way. One, because of a matter of perception, which is that when we say hymnody, or in the academic world, when we say hymnology, we're talking about a canon that is common. That canon is only common because of the forces that we've examined today. Michael Hahn says in New Songs of Celebration Rendered that the first wave of global song is in fact hymnody because it traveled with the missionaries and you impose it on groups of people. As the church, I'm thinking particularly of Jenkins' work on Next Christendom, as the church moves south, that's where the church is growing. The concept of what congregational repertoire is being pulled at in all directions. And, as Martin said, these cultures are oral in a double sense. One, they're oral because many of them have been traditionally oral music cultures, right, where you sing and learn and do. instead of reading the notated page. But oral also in the sense that for a majority of young worship leaders, you don't study with the score. You study on YouTube, right? Which is how music is learned and disseminated, or Spotify or whatever. So as the means of dissemination and mediation change, my hunch, and this is just, you know, a pub hunch, you know, that's kind of hunch, irresponsible hunches that we give, is that we will see more retuning in the trend of the retune movement. You know, Kevin Twitt, all those people who take these texts and experiment. We'll see more add-ons, which is not new. Think of camp meetings and gospel hymnody, right? So Chris Tallman's Amazing Grace has a whole new section. My chains are gone, I've been set free, right? So, and for a lot of young people, that is Amazing Grace. That is the canon. And we will all, I think there's a shift towards more of a singer-songwriter mentality where it's a more comprehensive fashioning of text and tune instead of traditional, you know, common meter or long meter, whatever it is that we're writing. But that's just my pub hunch.
Thank you. Rob, you had a question here.
Thanks very much to everybody for their contributions. I wonder whether you would each say something about what Amazing Grace as a text, both as in the written text and also the performance of it, means personally to you. That's what I'd like to hear you talk about. As part of then talking about, as a collective, its enduring nature as a song.
Thank you. Would you like to go first on that?
In terms of what it means to me, is very much capturing what I have said before. I grew up in very poor circumstances, and here I am. I have been caught up, as it were, within the institutions of this country as a chaplain to the Speaker of the House of Commons for nearly just over 9 years, as one of the chaplains of Her Majesty the Queen, and now a bishop in the Church of England. So for me, it speaks clearly of resilience, looking back on one's life. It speaks of resilience, it speaks of hope, it speaks of confidence, it speaks of overcoming, and it also speaks of thriving, because we're not bystanders. You know, we don't merely survive, you know, we thrive because we're God's children through the grace of God. So others may have meant harm for us. Others may have othered us. Others may have thought that because of the color of your skin, you're not as good as. But for the grace of God, I am. And it is an I am that is intermixed. For me, it is caught up in the word that the late Archbishop Desmond Tutu used quite a bit, Ubuntu. Ubuntu. I am because you are, and we are. The sense of finding ourselves in each other. And for me, the hope, the long-term hope, that we will truly find ourselves, whether we're pink or black or white or green or yellow or whatever shades, that we will find ourselves as the one human race, whether we're refugees or asylum seekers, and that we will embrace one another because we are the children of God. And we will say welcome, and we will say come, as our Lord Jesus also said come. So for me, those words are very deep and very personal.
That's hard for me to answer. To be honest, as a Brazilian church musician, it really doesn't ring a bell because of what we've talked about today. As an American church musician, I live in Texas. I'm constantly impressed by how streams become a river, and how there are very few of these artifacts that, due to the particular combination of component parts become almost an avatar, of a multimodal avatar that makes sense within a small parish church, that makes sense within an urban megachurch, makes sense in the voice of the President of the United States, makes sense in the voice of firefighters on 9/11. It makes sense. So I've learned to listen to that river in the ways that I was not accustomed to listening to beforehand. So the word that comes to mind for me is weight. There's a weight to that particular invitation of Amazing Grace, and that combination of text and tune. And as a musician, I can't splice them. It's always both. That gravitational pull for me is the combination of text and tune. That's an invitation to that commonality, and learning to embrace that invitation.
Thank you. I think for me, as a musician trained in notated music and used to performing from that and accompanying church congregations and choirs from that, Amazing Grace is always something that has challenged me, because the versions of it that are printed in the hymnals that I grew up learning from, playing from, I never found those entirely satisfactory as a musician. It's felt that it's never quite pinned down in that. And yet we have this sweet sound. And where does that reside? I think it's a reminder, those of us who are trained in that notated system of music can often default to that, well, all you need to know is there in the notation, I told you what to do. It's a reminder that that really doesn't work. It exists, and it exists in multiple different ways for different people at different times and different places. Because of the combination of words and music and an adaptability, a kind of ability to shift according to the context, that I think has never been satisfactorily captured in a way that's my default way of accessing materials on the printed page and text, and musical text. So that'll be my reflection.
I'm going to speak very personally then. Although I didn't sing the hymn or the song till I was in my teens, there was a much earlier me that found a home in it, because I grew up in rural poverty. We moved from bedsit to caravan, flat, moved on and on. And I was always lost. I could never find my way. I was in a new place. And the word home has all sorts of resonances for me, because it was never secure, it was never there. And so anything hymn that has the word home in is very powerful to me. And things like I heard the voice of Jesus say, which ends up till travelling days are done. So I reside a bit in, apart from being lost, which I'm permanently lost, I don't mind being lost in life, because it's all right not to know what the answer is to something. Jesus had questions to all our answers. So I'm very happy to go on in questions. I'm always flat hunting, house hunting, to the despair of my husband, who would like to live a much more settled life. So the verse where I reside is through many dangers, toils and snares. I have already come, and I can therefore go on to face other dangers, toils, and give me some more dangers, toils and snares. 'Tis grace hath brought me safe thus far, and I keep on going and going and going, and from here I'm going to Heathrow to go to Washington, and that's but one day grace will lead me home.
Thank you for the question. I know if you or others will also join in giving your views. But personally, I can come at it from a variety of angles. But one is that somebody at school was quite accurately described by the teachers as a grown-up, and therefore told not to sing, just to kind of remind them. And then I married an ethnomusicologist, and asked a question earlier, and our children, through Patricia, are very musical. So as somebody who goes a lot to church, and can't sing. I quite like the tune that is something I can kind of groan along to. And it to me, is therefore something I can hold on to in a world that is slightly strange. I just love terms like redemption and grace and hope. I'm trying to understand what they mean. And I also write about sport a little. I found that sport headlines are more or less the only place you see words like redemption or atonement now. And also words like hell. And you sometimes get a headline in the World Cup or the Euros, now women's Euros. My week of hell, says the goalkeeper who let the ball in. Well, if hell's anything, it's more than a week. But anyway, I'm really interested in how, I'm sure I do take in something about grace or something about hope from Walk On With Hope in Your Heart, which is sung like a hymn in the secular setting of a football stadium. And since Archbishop Tutu has been mentioned, and since I now seem to be really keen on memorials that are spoken but not memorials that are marked, Archbishop Tutu's eulogy for Grace Shepherd was lovely about Grace. And Grace Shepherd herself, who had challenges in life, who's perhaps known as, amongst other things, having been married to Bishop David Shepherd. But she wrote beautifully about how, about mental health challenges of being caught up with somebody who's famous and so on, and expectations of you. And the fact that if you have the name Grace, people also, particularly if you're involved in the church, people expect you to be full of grace, and all the time, even when they're being really annoying, and asking you, how are you now? Which has within it so many challenges if they know that, like Cooper, you had challenges in life. And she said that for all that, this is in a book called Of Pits and Pedestals, she felt she was in a pit and her husband had been put on a pedestal all the time. But she wrote that her parents, who were very, very committed evangelicals, had not chosen her name without care, I think is the way she put it. That she felt both a burden but also a blessing with that word grace. So, thank you for the question.
So a little time, so if there are one or two more questions, I think we can accommodate those too. So please do raise your hand and the microphone will be brought. Further thoughts. Not seeing any, but I can't necessarily see behind all the pillars, so do wave vigorously if I'm not spotting you. No, I don't think so. Okay, in that case, I wonder if any of our panel have any kind of concluding reflections based on the questions that we've heard and the responses we've shared. Anybody, anything further we want to offer?
I hope today was not just an academic exercise, and even if it began like an academic exercise, that it will be more, it may become more than that, where we dig a little bit deeper and ask the questions that we've never asked before of ourselves, of our faith, of the faith, and what does it mean? Ask questions about redemption, and redemption for those who have done awful things, and grace, because the faith, the Christian faith, is not about rituals. It is not about whether we genuflect and how many times we do it in one portion of the service, we do it across ourselves, or whether we neatly, fix the liturgy in a particular way, and if we don't get that tune, we're upset. And we were at General Synod this week, and the guy wasn't fast enough putting the words up on the screen. But exactly the same thing happened. We heard the tune, and we started singing the traditional song. But by the time he got the thing up on the thing, we realized that was not the song he wanted. and some people were upset. So for me, the Christian faith is not about any of these things. The Christian faith is not about the labels, whether we're evangelicals, Anglo-Catholics, Methodists, Anglicans, any of those nonsense. The Christian faith is about grace, redemption, hope, love, faith, all those things. And if we could just find it and engage with it, interrogate it, because that's what we don't do. We don't interrogate it. You know, I once, a preacher, many years ago, before women were ordained, a preacher had the audacity to get into the pulpit, and he said, I don't believe that women, you know, I don't believe it is the will of God for women to be ordained. What he didn't know was that he had someone in his congregation who felt that God had called her for ordination since she was 14 years old. My hand popped up so fast during his sermon. I said, excuse me, how do you know what the will of God is? You know, so I want us to interrogate the word that we're reading and not just say because it is in this book, that's it, or because it is set for this music, that's it. Faith needs to become alive and real, because that's how we're going to set our children on fire for faith. That's how they're going to say, this place is on fire. The kind of fire that lets our hearts burn within us. And that's what I'd love to see. That's what I'd love to come out of this.
Amen to that.
And in all of that, what hymnody does, or songleading, or whatever, what Christian music does, is to give the congregation voice. And whether it's, I can't think of the right expression, but whether it's written hymns or whether people are just responding from the congregation, or whether they're singing in, harmonies are being put in, however the Holy Spirit moves in our hymnody, it's the congregation's voice. At the beginning of where the Reformation is expected to have begun from, there's a strong sense of the loss of the sung liturgy in European churches. And hymns started to be written or to grow up so that the congregation could still sing. Do you want us to be blocks of wood? Do you want us to be like stones? Do you want us not to have voices? And they function best, hymns and songs function best, where they're not confined to certain places, either as here's the worship and here's the rest, or confined to little elements in the service, but where they spring up through the service, and they're the congregation's way of responding. And a really good, intelligent hymn does it exactly what you're saying. It interrogates and has dialogue with the whole worship experience.
Thank you. A few things. Firstly, yesterday we had 20 minutes and today 7 minutes, and the start's got an hour, quite right, but it's only a short time to say something. But there is a long history of the law in this country and around the world that struggles with slavery as well as abolitionism. And I think at some point in this year of celebration it might be worth tracing the timeline, just very simply, because the most famous case in the English common law of slavery was in 1772, only weeks before Amazing Grace, which was the case where Lord Mansfield issued a writ of habeas corpus to free the slave James Sunset, and cast doubt on whether slavery was ever lawful, let alone mandated in English law, because the laws as perceived were in order to facilitate that trade and traffic. But this slave, who was from Africa to the Caribbean to America, but back to England, and was about to go back out, while he was in England, needed to be freed. And lawyers right the way through to William Cowper, who's a lawyer, and President Obama, who's a lawyer, are not all bad, and are sometimes trying to work towards social justice. That's one thing. The second thing is on redemption. Over the decades, I've advised, I usually ignore my advice, Catholic bishops on law and ethics, and they asked me to write a draft of what's going to be their statement on prisons. They didn't really like my draft, so it's much better now as it came out. But they did keep the title, I suggested. which was from Pope John Paul II's talk to prisoners for the millennium, and he called it a place of redemption. So the Catholic bishops called their document a place of redemption. And if prisons should be a place of redemption, which I feel they should be, but they're not enough, then so much more should museums be, and churches be, and festivals be. And so I want to commend the work that's going on here, and I think it's important that we seize these anniversaries in the way that you've done. And the final thing I wanted to say, for those who weren't here yesterday, is that even though these are one-syllable words after the word amazing in the first verse, and even though it's fabulous, I'm always slightly worried, will somebody in the modern era take offence? So the last line was blind, in the first verse, was blind, but now I see. I was slightly sensitive about it. So I asked St Vincent's School for the Visually Impaired in Liverpool to help me on that. And I played a little bit of their answer yesterday, and I'm now tweeting it. And they have no problem at all. These little children, they talked about it, and they sang it, they talked about it, and they understand the subtle differences between lying, literally, and metaphorically. And they ended up with little pupils saying, we know that at St Vincent's we have the real vision.
Well, thank you very much to our panelists. Thank you all for the questions and the discussion. It's been a really rich time of sharing and thinking and reflecting. I'd like to invite you all to show your appreciation for our panelists.